The Violence of Abstraction: The Analytic Foundations of Historical Materialism by Derek Sayre. Quote, as if the task were the dialectical balancing of concepts, and not the grasping of real relations. End quote. Karl Marx, General Introduction to Grundrisse, 1857. Preface. It has become fashionable in some circles to decry, quote, marxology. In one way, this is odd. We do not speak in the same tones of, quote, Kantology or, quote, Weberology. Though studies of Kant and Weber abound. Interpretive commentary on the work of major thinkers is a common and legitimate scholarly enterprise, and not always a merely scholastic one. In the social sciences, at least, explicit reflection on established paradigms is a normal and perfectly proper way in which problems are clarified and disciplines advance, particularly in times of theoretical crisis. Because the pioneering work of a Durkheim or a Keynes does constitute a paradigm in Kuhn's sense, a framework within which substantive researches continually go on. The form which theoretical debate takes is often that of a questioning return to and reinterpretation of the writings of an acknowledged past master. The context of such discussion is often a growing awareness of empirical anomalies, which the relevant paradigms have difficulties encompassing. Every generation reappropriates its intellectual heritage in accord with its needs and priorities. In this sense, I see nothing wrong with marxology, and this book is unashamedly a marxological work. I focus on Marx's own texts, but I do so in the light of current preoccupations, and in order ultimately to help further knowledge of the world we live in. I do not presume that this knowledge can be directly derived from Marx's writings themselves. He, after all, died more than a century ago, but critical reflections upon their theoretical foundations may aid his successors in their endeavors to produce it. But there is, nonetheless, a particular problem with writing about Marx. The problem is a moral as much as an intellectual one. No other modern social thinker has influenced social and political movements as much as Marx. Some 1/3 of the world's population now live under governments which claim Marx's imprimatur for their policies and indeed legitimate their very existence in terms of his supposed theory of history. Marxist parties of varying size and strength claim to speak for, quote, the people. Everywhere, they are permitted. This is not the case with a Kant or a Weber, and greatly raises the stakes of intellectual debate. Questions of what Marx meant by this or that have an inescapably political as well as a scholarly context, and may sometimes have very practical implications. In many cases, the claim that Marx held such and such a view is itself, absurd as this may be, considered sufficient to confer authority upon that view. Nobody, as far as I know, has yet been incarcerated or killed for their heretical interpretations of Kant or Weber, or to come to that, for their orthodox ones. Marxology is therefore rarely a merely academic pursuit. However disinterested one's scholarly motives, conclusions often become part of other people's politics. The study of Marx can be a coded form of social criticism in East and West alike. It can be sniveling apologetics, but it can hardly be politically innocent. It is, of course, This political context of Marx scholarship, the association of Marxist theory with what is claimed to be socialist practice, which gives the charge of, quote, mere marxology, end quote, its rhetorical force. The accusation of, quote, scholasticism, quote, academic Marxism, is a convenient moral bludgeon with which to beat, quote, bourgeois intellectuals into shamefaced conformity, or marginalize the political pertinence of their researches. Meghnad Desai in a recent deplorable review of Theodore Shannon's Late Marx and the Russian Road, a book which painstakingly demonstrates Marx's deviation from Marxist orthodoxy across a wide range of politically sensitive issues, and traces the organized, quote, forgetting of this within the communist movement, avails himself of this device in order not to discuss the challenge to received views which the book poses. Peter Binns does much the same in his grotesque dismissal, in Socialist Review, of Kolakowski's magisterial, if eminently disputable, 3-volume history of Marxism as, quote, chit-chat from the common rooms, end quote. It is very often just those. They frequently turn out to inhabit universities who believe themselves to possess, in their own pet version of Marx, the truth incarnate, the revealed secret of history, who are the first to denounce serious Marx scholarship as, quote, marxology. In this environment, I believe the study of what Marx actually said, not merely to be an academically defensible, but a politically virtuous enterprise. If intellectuals are to be of any service to humanity, they must first of all serve the truth. The political context of Marxist debate, in short, makes it more, rather than less important to respect the constraints of academic scholarship when trying to expound his ideas. This is not to say I believe a definitive or a disinterested interpretation of Marxist thought to be either possible or desirable, and this is not my aim in this book. Marx wrote an enormous amount over a period of many years. His legacy is very varied. Texts like Capital One, finished for the press and revised through several editions, form the smaller part of the corpus that has come down to us. Unpublished drafts like The German Ideology, the Grundrisse, or the remaining volumes of Capital, all now treated as major works, are part of our inheritance in ways that were often not for earlier generations. Apart from his economics, Marx penned political tracts like the Manifesto, an inordinate amount of penny-aligned journalism, sometimes on subjects he knew little about, and even poetry. He left a voluminous private correspondence. There are obvious problems as to what weight to give to these different kinds of texts, dating from different periods of his life. Not all that Marx wrote was clear, unambiguous, or even consistent. It would be exceedingly surprising if it were. But beyond this, why should we in any case seek to be definitive? It seems to me perfectly reasonable, as well as being unavoidable, to read Marx in different ways at different times and for different purposes. It is a testimony to his greatness that we can do so, notwithstanding all attempts to freeze his ideas into formulaic and dogmatic molds. Marx's thought lives insofar as it is interpreted anew by others, in the light of their changing needs. It is no more eternal than the 19th century that produced it. Definitiveness, then, is, so far as I am concerned, a chimerical grail. Indeed, I believe its assertion to be profoundly authoritarian and coercive, indicative of an approach to theory which is the opposite of emancipatory. This is not, however, to argue for an interpretive free-for-all. As Max Weber once remarked, Marx is not a taxicab one can drive where one will. It is, I think, often possible to demonstrate that Marx did not adhere to positions commonly ascribed to him. Much of the argument of this book is of this sort. There is for me both a scholarly and a political point in engaging in such debate, scholastic and so-called marxological, as it might frequently appear. Precisely because Marx's name is so often invoked to authorize and legitimate contemporary doctrines and practices, to know what he did and did not say, and what can and cannot fairly be said in his name, becomes important. This is, then, why I have written this book, not in order to establish some new impeccably accredited orthodoxy, but rather to challenge the authority claims of the old. I hope thereby to suggest the possibility of reading Marx differently, of seeing him as pioneering an approach to the understanding of society and history which offers more empirical purchase than that normally identified with his name. I would like to make it clear, finally, that I do not consider such modes of argument to be in any way capable, in and of themselves, of establishing the validity of historical materialism, whether in my heretical variant or any other. Capital is not the Holy Bible, and provenance no criterion for truth. That Marx said something does not make it right, and he was frequently and demonstrably wrong. Textual commentary is the necessary currency of a study such as this. But the test of an adequate analytic framework is its capacity to make sense of the world, not its conformity with Marx's or anybody else's text. The point is a banal one, but in this context probably needs to be made. This book, then, is mainly a study of Marx's ideas, a work of marxology. It presents an argument about the analytic foundations of historical materialism, as exemplified in Marx's own analytic practice. Its specific concern is with the major general concepts of his sociology, and the way he uses them in substantive inquiry. The argument is organized around the key categories in which he frames what for many is the classic summary of the historical materialist perspective. The 1859 Preface to a Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, the concepts of forces of production, relations of production, economic structure, and superstructure. I argue that these fundamental concepts of Marx's have been comprehensively misunderstood, indeed fetishized, in his own sense of that key motive in his thought, within mainstream Marxism, and that the, quote, theory of history, which historical materialism is normally taken as offering, rests on these fetishized foundations. Misunderstandings among Marxists of what these concepts denote and how they may legitimately be used testify to a failure to comprehend their anchorage in Marx's distinctive methodology, the analytic practice I characterize in my earlier book, Marx's Methods, as critique. These misunderstandings, I believe, have done enormous violence to what is most innovative and emancipatory in Marx's social thought. Rather more importantly, they eventuate in a form of historical materialism which does equal violence to real history, but the history people have made in the past, that history people have made in the past, and that they might seek to make in the present. Marx's own practice offers an alternative and an analytically superior version of historical materialism, which I try to outline and defend. To develop this argument, I need economically to exemplify the readings of Marx I reject. Throughout this book, I take G.A. Cohen's influential work, Karl Marx's Theory of History, a Defense, as the best modern exposition of the standard interpretation of Marx's fundamental concepts, which has not been superseded in the decades since it appeared. Cohen's book is immensely valuable for its philosophical clarity of definition and coherence of argument. He outlines, quote, traditional historical materialism more clearly and defends it more ably than anyone else known to me. This book is not, however, primarily concerned with Cohen, despite his frequent appearance in its pages. There is much in his work and the debates it has inspired which I do not address. I nowhere, for instance, discuss his debates with Elster. For Elster's own ambitious reconstruction of Marxism by way of game theory. Nor do I consider Cohen's own shifts of position since 1978. I discuss this original book only as an exemplar. Cohen's understanding of Marx's fundamental concepts, my sole concern in this book, is shared wholly or in part by many Marxists across a variety of perspectives who do not otherwise subscribe to his, quote, technological variant of historical materialism. This book, then, is both much less and at the same time somewhat more than a critique of Cohen's Marxism as such. The argument is organized as follows. Chapter 1 is a kind of prologue in which I briefly outline the conventional interpretation of Marx's concepts and claims in the 1859 preface, and by way of preliminary skirmish, discuss Engels' qualifications of these claims in a well-known series of late letters. The next 3 chapters form the heart of the book. In these, I respectively discuss Marx's own usage of the concepts of productive forces, relations of production/economic structure, and superstructure in his substantive work. I argue in each case that Marx's use of these concepts differed radically from that normally ascribed to him. I also suggest that his analysis of capitalism provides more than adequate ground for seeing orthodox conceptions of productive forces, economic structure, and superstructure as fetishized. These are, to use Marx's own vocabulary, quote, idealizations or, quote, abstractions, which falsely generalize from the misleading phenomenal forms our social relations take under capitalism. Chapter 5 is a brief interlude devoted wholly to Cohen's characterization of Marxism as a species of functionalism, which I dispute. The most technical chapter in the book, it can safely be omitted. The most technical chapter in the book, it can safely be omitted by those whose interest lies in Marx rather than Cohen. Chapter 6 ties the overall argument of the book together by way of a consideration of the relation between history and theory in Marx's work and its implications for the formation and use of analytic categories in substantive inquiry. I do not pretend originality for everything argued here. Various intellectual influences on my argument will be apparent, of which some deserve particular acknowledgement. I would single out for special mention the work of Bertil Ohlmann, whose Alienation remains for me the classic study of Marx's novelty, the historical writings, which are profoundly theoretical in their import, of Edward Thompson, Christopher Hill, and other Marxist historians, and the path-breaking Marxist anthropology of Maurice Godelier. Many of the ideas developed here originated in collaborative work with Philip Corrigan, not only in our recent study of English state formation, the Great Arch, but in our previous books with Harvey Ramsey on socialist construction in post-revolutionary societies. Patrick Murray's helpful criticism of Marx's method in his review in Philosophy of the Social Sciences jolted me into rethinking the importance of Marx's Hegelian background, something I undoubtedly neglected in the earlier book. Ted Benton, Philip Corrigan, Greg McLennan, and Gavin Williams read the first draft of this book in full and made extensive, sometimes highly critical, but invariably useful comments. I have tried to respond to their anxieties, even if on some points I have remained obstinate. Their generosity has, at least I hope, made some points in my argument rather less murky than they were in their first formulation. David Frisby indulged a good deal of thinking aloud on my part and added some ideas of his own. Sean McGee was, as ever, all that one could want in an editor, and Blackwell a positive pleasure to work with. Much of the book was written during a period of 2-term study leave from University of Glasgow. It would have taken a lot longer otherwise. To all my thanks, Derek Sayer. Glasgow, Scotland.